Welcome to the very first episode of CBmE&U, the Centre for Biomedical Ethics new podcast. My name is Sinead. I'm a research fellow here at CBmE.
And I'm James, also a research fellow here at CBmE. And today, we welcome our director of the Centre for Biomedical Ethics, Professor Julian Savulescu. Welcome, Julian.
Hi.
Thank you for coming on the podcast, Julian. We have some quick questions to get to know you a little bit better. Coffee or copy?
Yeah, I don't really know what copy is. What is it?
So coffee is a Singaporean coffee where they roast the beans with sugar and then serve the drink with condensed milk or evaporated milk.
Yeah, we had this really nice Singaporean coffee where they roast the beans in butter. I really like that. But I'm not sure if that's copy. But I went to some coffee outlet and I've never had this in my life. You had to ask not to have sugar put in your coffee, which is sort of a recipe for diabetes. So I'm not sure if it's the sort of pro-diabetic coffee or just the one roasted in butter, but I like the one roasted in butter.
Excellent. Good for future reference. Second question, what song would you sing at karaoke?
I vowed never to go into a karaoke booth again in my life.
Wait, the key word there was again.
So if I was forced into it, I'm not really sure. I mean, maybe AC/DC, It's a Long Way to the Top.
I would pay good money to see that.
Actually, we used to sing it when I was in primary school. So we used to sing It's a Long Way to the Tuck Shop if you want a sausage roll. That's the only bit I'd sing.
New and improved.
Yeah. So you would sing that bit, is what you're saying.
Just that bit.
Just this bit.
We have mics. Just saying. We're right here.
Thank you for answering that one. And third question, what country would you like to travel to the most?
I have to say I'm a bit over travel. My main goal in life is to devote myself to my work here in Singapore and not do any overseas travel. But I guess still on my bucket list of countries to travel to is actually Turkey. And I'm planning, I hope to go to Istanbul at some point. My father escaped from Romania after the Second World War in a small boat with no belongings and landed in Turkey and always told me I should visit there. And so I feel like a kind of part of it is sort of recreating the journey with my father. So, I'd like to go to Istanbul.
Okay, Julian, so let's get down to business. All right. I'm going to sound a bit like Jerry Seinfeld asking this question. Like, what's the deal with ethics? So what is your interest in ethics? Why are you interested in ethics? And can you tell us more about what you take the field of bioethics to be and why it's important?
Yeah, so I first got interested in ethics. Actually, in high school, I was sort of interested in religion then, and that was sort of main route into ethics in my school, which was a Christian school. But I did medicine, and in first year medicine in 1982, you could do an extra subject, which I took philosophy because I was interested in those sort of deep philosophical questions. And one of the subjects in philosophy was practical ethics taught by Peter Singer, who had just written the book Practical Ethics in 1979. And this was a revelation to me how somebody could argue logically and persuasively and challengingly about topics like abortion or euthanasia or the treatment of animals or poverty or war. And so I thought, this is, I really want to do this. But I had started medicine and I thought I should continue. And I picked it up after I was finished medicine and started a part-time master's at Monash University while I was practicing as a young doctor. And at that point I thought, ethics is really important. The most interesting questions in medicine are ethical, about whether, a patient should live or die, whether an expensive treatment should be funded. So really the sort of the challenges were ethical, the rest was technical. But now I've come to realise that ethics is everywhere, having then gone on to do a PhD in ethics and spent time in a philosophy department. I realised how pervasive and important issues of philosophy and ethics are, because science can never tell you what you should do. It can't tell you whether you should live longer or whether you should die. Those are ethical questions. And a lot of people think they're personal questions. They're just questions that we answer by, intuition or by talking to our family or friends. But my experience over the last 30 years has taught me that philosophy does have a lot to offer in identifying important ethical issues and thinking through them. So just to give an example, having come to Singapore recently, I'm struck by the speed limit being 90 kilometres an hour. I've come from Europe where in the UK it's 120, in France it's 130, and in Germany it's unlimited. So the speed limit is literally a life or death issue. It will determine how many people live and die on the roads. It will determine what sorts of jobs people have, how economically efficient a country is. So science can tell you, what the reduction in the death toll is by reducing the speed limit by 10 kilometres an hour. But it can't tell you whether you should do that because there are a lot of different values at stake. So if you ask what's the right speed limit, what's the best speed limit? The best speed limit for safety is the lowest speed limit, Singapore's speed limit. The best speed limit for economic efficiency is the highest speed limit. The best speed limit for reducing carbon emissions is a lower speed limit. The best for convenience and pleasure and choice is a higher speed limit. So how you balance all of these different values is an ethical issue. So just what speed limit, a country decides to set is determined by weighing different values. Now, science is important, as I mentioned, to tell you how many lives you'll save or to tell you what the risks are given the road surfaces in your particular country. But once all those facts are in, there's still an ethical issue around how to decide on your speed limit. So those sorts of questions arise every day around what level of taxation to impose, whether to put sugar taxes in place, whether to have a carbon tax, whether you should eat, whether you should continue to care for your elderly mother at home or to seek supported accommodation or a nursing home. All of these are ethical questions that that formal ethics, that philosophical ethics and academic ethics can help us think about.
An ethicist, and I'm sure I've gotten a particular question a lot, and I'm sure you've gotten versions of this question too, and it's, well, in science, we know how we can solve problems. We can conduct experiments, we can look out there in the world and see what's out there and conduct experiments to see what happens when we conduct those experiments. So the question that I often get is something along the lines of, what's the methodology in ethics? How can we solve the questions of which value is more important and which one we weigh more heavily, and all these kinds of various questions about what's more important ultimately?
Yeah. I've worked for many bosses, and they often laugh at me when I start work. They say, "What do? Do you just sit in an armchair and think? Is that what you do?" And in part, it is what we do. So there are two aspects. So say Singapore's trying to answer, a question: what should their speed limit be, or what should they have mandatory vaccination in the pandemic, or should they allow gene editing? And there are two ways of answering that question. And I think both are important, but both need to be brought together. So the first part is to apply ethical theories, concepts, and principles. So human beings have been thinking about ethics ever since they could think, because ethics evolved as a mechanism of promoting in-group cooperation. So ethical norms arose in evolutionary terms to facilitate us surviving as vulnerable beings, in a harsh world, and particularly enabling small groups of around 150 to survive. So the basic ethical, principles are around not harming members of your group, cooperating, desert, responsibility, these sorts of concepts. But of course, people have also been thinking about more sophisticated ethical theories and principles for thousands of years. So there are a number of basic ethical theories that can be applied to a problem. One of the most basic is called utilitarianism, or sometimes called act consequentialism, which says the right course of action is the action which has the best consequences. So it's a pretty intuitive theory. And in the moral version of this, each person is to count for one and none for more than one. So everyone's well-being or utility or happiness or health counts equally, and we should choose the action which, promotes that value maximally. So in the pandemic, most countries adopted a utilitarian approach, which said we have to save the most people from dying from COVID. That was the outcome measure, deaths from COVID, or lives saved from COVID. And the policies were aimed at maximising that. Now, of course, you could have chosen a different outcome measure. You could have said we want to save the most lives overall, including people whose lives are threatened by other diseases. Or you could have said we want to save the most quality-adjusted life years. That is, enable people to live as long as possible with the best quality of life. And that may not have had the same, policies as simply reducing deaths from COVID. So that's one family of theories that can be applied. Another family of theories that people are familiar with are rights theories that say people have basic human rights that need to be respected. Deontology is another group of theories which say that certain rules have to be obeyed, particularly religious rules. So the Ten Commandments is a form of deontology. So these can come into conflict. So sometimes the right action involves, the death of an innocent person or telling a lie, and or according to consequentialism or utilitarianism. So these theories can conflict. There are also basic principles like respecting people's liberty or autonomy, providing benefits or improving their well-being, and justice. So you've got these theories and principles that can be applied to problems. And then there are also particular the public's attitudes and personal values. So how they see what's important. So do they think that the goal of allocation of limited resources, ventilators or vaccines in the pandemic should go to saving the most lives, saving the vulnerable, giving priority to younger people, giving priority to healthcare workers? So each of these strategies can be favoured by different ethical theories, but also the public have often quite strong views about ethical issues. And what I've tried to do in Singapore is bring my own theory, which tries to blend both of the ethical theories and principles and concepts together with public intuitions to form policies. So, for example, we did this in the pandemic, and we looked at ethical theories around the allocation of ventilators and vaccines and public values. And what we found was a striking convergence with some theories, such as utilitarianism and the public's values, where they usually wanted their vaccines or ventilators to go to saving the greatest number of lives, saving younger lives versus older lives, and improving the quality of people's lives maximally. And so that meant that if you're going to, for example, save the greatest number of lives, you should give priority to people with the best chance of surviving, or the group that needed in the case of ventilators, the ventilator for a shorter period of time. So you can get from theory and public values to determinant practices. Another example was around mandatory vaccination. So I developed a 4-stage procedure for deciding whether mandatory vaccination was justified that had 4 criteria. The first one was the gravity of the problem that was facing the community. The secondly was the safety and effectiveness of the vaccines. The third was the extra value that you get, or the extra lives that you save, by making the policy mandatory or coercive rather than voluntary or incentivised. And the last was the proportionality of the coercion or the disincentive used. Now, each of those factors then has to be decided. What is proportionate? What is safety? So is something that is safe for 15,000 people safe enough? Or do you need to test it on 100,000 people or 500,000 people? So even in something like safety, even when you specify it as a major value, opens up questions about how you decide where the line is drawn. So ethics is about how to prioritise different values and draw lines. And there are a variety of theoretical and empirical procedures involving surveying the public that can be used to form those policies.
There we go. That's why we're useful.
So what I'm hearing, though, is an almost insurmountable amount of work that needs to be done to solve just one ethical issue. And so what I wanted to ask you was, we have the Centre for Biomedical Ethics here. There are a lot of people here working on different projects. And I wanted to ask you, what is the importance of having an ethics centre where we actually sit in our chairs all day long doing work? Why should people be excited and feel justified in having an ethics centre that looks into these issues?
Well, just to sort of correct you slightly, you said there's an almost insurmountable amount of work. Practical ethics, which is what we're doing, has to inform everyday decisions, everyday policy. So sometimes you don't have a lot of time. So you have to make the best decision you can according to the resources that you have. So there's a famous example in philosophy about the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who was an existentialist. And he reportedly faced this dilemma, a personal ethical dilemma, about whether to go and fight for the French resistance during the Nazi occupation or to care for his elderly mother, stay at home and care for his elderly. Now, he might make that decision instantaneously, but that's all you can do. So, it can be very quick and you can still be held accountable and you still have to do the best that you can in terms of reflecting insofar as you've got time to reflect. So ethics have to be very quick, because if it's to have an effect, it has to be there as the decision is being made. But when you have more time and resources, you can do more research, you can do more reflection. So the point of a centre, particularly a centre funded with research grants, is to take time to gather public opinion, to assemble different ethical theories, to see what other countries or other cultures or other professionals have written and thought about the area and bring those together. So what you see in ethics is you're often reinventing the wheel. People, start again with a new form for ethics, review or applications when they've been developed for 20 years. And so part of our job is to synthesize what's already known across the whole world and translate that into particular challenges that, say, Singapore has, but then also to do new research involving the public and application of ethical theories in a philosophical way to generate novel solutions. So the benefit of having an ethics centre is first of all to do this rigorously. Secondly, it's to bring a wide range of disciplines to bear. So practical problems often require philosophical reflection around the values and the theories and principles, empirical research involving social scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, legal experts to inform the kind of legal dimensions of the problem, basic scientists to provide relevant factual information about the dilemmas, public policy specialists, people in ministries and government to enable policy to be enacted, to bringing all these players to the table in order to develop and implement policies that affect people, and then to get the feedback on how those affect people. So a centre is able to do that, whereas a single individual isn't able to do that.
So I want to talk about Singapore. Specifically, is there anything particular about Singapore that makes the application of bioethics particularly interesting in any way? Or are there any applications of bioethics or issues that arise when we think about a center in Singapore or ethics issues in Singapore that might not arise elsewhere in the world? Why don't we just take whatever research Oxford is generating or Stanford is generating or Harvard is generating and just apply it to Singapore? Is there something special about a center in Singapore?
Well, every country and every group has its own identity and features that make it different to other groups. So, Singapore is extremely multicultural. There are a number of, ethnic groups, Chinese, Malay, Indian. So it's not the same as, Australia or the United Kingdom. So there are many factors that are specific to Singapore that mean that, what is fit in one country won't necessarily be fit, in Singapore. But that applies whether you're in Malaysia or Singapore or the Philippines or wherever. What attracts me to Singapore, as a practical ethicist, Singapore is unique in the world because it's a pioneer. It is capable of adopting new policies and implementing them very rapidly because of the close cohesion between government and their ability to make decisions decisively and quickly, and experts, including academic experts. So there's the opportunity to do things here that there probably isn't in lots of the other parts of the world. It's also been extremely adept at taking the best of other countries and then quickly deploying them in Singapore. So, I see it as a great, experimental ground for bioethics where you have the opportunity to both develop policy that's culturally and nationally specific, but also that takes the best of what's in the rest of the world and develops it and implements it.
How confident are we really that there's this thing called ethics in the universal sense? A lot of people believe that ethics is pretty relative to one's culture, one's background, maybe even one's family values. So why should we think that there's this thing called universal ethics, it's a kind of standard or code that everybody should hold themselves to?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and many people pose that isn't ethics just relative to culture or sort of personal values? I mean, if you think that, that's sometimes called ethical relativism. And if you think that, then there's really no ethics at all because, the Nazis had their own coherent, particular set of values. It's not as if we say, well, they just had a different set of values to us and it's all relative. People think that what the Nazis did was really wrong, universally wrong, and that's how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights arose. So I think ethical relativism is a mistake. I think cultures can be mistaken about certain values, and there is a kind of universality to ethics. What is correct, though, I think, is context specificity. So what can be right in one country can be wrong in another. So I'll give you an example of that. In the 1980s, many people believe that reproductive freedom, reproductive liberty, procreative autonomy, sometimes it's called, is very important. People should be free to choose how to form a family, when to form a family, whether they have genetic testing of their offspring, whether they have IVF and genetic selection or termination of pregnancy after prenatal testing. That should all be up to individuals. That was the lesson of the Second World War and the problems of eugenics, that we should leave decisions about reproduction to individuals themselves and not force it onto them. Now, in the 1980s, Cyprus had this significant problem with the genetic disorder thalassemia, which was using up 100% of their blood supply and 50% of their drug budget in the treatment of thalassemia. Now, this is inherited, and genetic tests became available for it. So what the church did was require people who wanted to be married to have a carrier test to see if they were carriers of thalassemia. And if you're both a carrier, then there's a 1 in 4 chance your baby will have thalassemia major and require extensive medical treatment and have a very painful and shortened life. So all it did was require couples have carrier testing. It didn't require that they go on and test their pregnancy, and it certainly didn't require that they have a termination of pregnancy. But because of the problem that people had witnessed with thalassemia, everyone who found out that they were carriers, nearly everyone, went on to have prenatal testing and terminated pregnancies. And the rates of thalassemia dropped, and the problems on pressure on blood and drugs was released. Now, that was coercive. That we don't have that requirement for carrier testing in Singapore or in the United Kingdom or in Australia, because we don't have the problem with the rates of thalassemia that Cyprus had. So while you can have a certain level of reproductive freedom, when resources are plentiful, freedom can be constrained as resources become scarce. And the classic instantiation of that was the introduction of mandatory vaccination during the pandemic, when resources became constrained. So context specificity is important. Now, if ethics isn't just relative, how do we decide what these universal principles and are? So a good example of this mixture between universality and context specificity was a piece of research that Edmund Awad and colleagues did in 2018 called the Moral Machines Experiment. So Edmund Awad is a computer scientist. He created a platform where people could sign up and play games around ethical dilemmas. And the ethical dilemma he used was the famous trolley problem, developed by Philippa Foot in Oxford in the 1950s, a philosopher, where in the classic version, a trolley or a train is going down a track into a tunnel, and it's going to inevitably kill 5 workmen. You can't stop it, but all you can do is divert the trolley down a different track, but then it will go down into a different tunnel and kill a single worker who wouldn't otherwise have died. So the real life version of this now is the programming of autonomous cars. So, autonomous car can be, going down the road with 5 occupants, and something happens, a tree falls, it's going to hit the tree and kill the occupants, or it can veer off the road and kill a single pedestrian. Should it veer off the road and kill the single innocent pedestrian? Or the car has 3 elderly passengers, and there's a small child on the side of the road. So Edmund Awad varied a whole lot of these different variables around number of people, pedestrians, dogs, cats, age of people breaking the law and crossing illegally versus obeying the law, and ended up with 40 million responses to these different dilemmas. So he had responses from Asia, from South America, from Europe, and these showed some cultural differences. For example, people in Asia didn't prioritise younger lives over older lives, but in the rest of the world they did. They thought you should give priority to saving younger rather than older lives. And the 4 strongest preferences that he found were the top one was you should prioritise human over non-human, animal lives. The second one is you should save more people rather than fewer. The third one is you should save younger rather than older people. And the fourth one was you should save people who are obeying the law rather than breaking the law. But that people, for example, in South America had preference for saving women over men. So you can now get these universal preferences. And then the job of us and of practical ethics is to decide which of those is most ethically justifiable and to use ethical theories. So, for example, a variety of ethical theories such as utilitarianism or what's sometimes called contractualism, what would you choose if you didn't know who you were being affected by an ethical dilemma? These all converge on saving the greater number of people and saving younger rather than older lives. So by looking at a convergence between preferences and defensible general ethical theories, we can start to think about what might be universal policies. But notice that there might be some cultural differences. For example, some countries may give greater weight, which is justifiable according to some ethical theories, particularly retributivist approaches to ethics, for obeying the law rather than breaking the law. Now, we've recently done work with Edmund Awad about gamifying dilemmas around selecting embryos or gene editing for enhancing traits like intelligence. So recently a study was done in the US of US participants that looked at the general public's views around using genetic selection, that is selecting embryos based on genetic tests or editing those embryos for a small increase in intelligence. This is now possible with genetic testing to increase the chance of getting into a top 100 college from 3% to 5%, and assuming that one in 10 people were using it. And in the US, only around 5 to 10% of people thought it was wrong to use special preparation coaching for improving entrance into college. But strikingly, only about 20% were outright opposed to using genetic selection, and only about 30% were opposed to using gene editing. So these are quite high numbers. So we repeated this with the Singaporean population, and we found even higher acceptance, particularly in the Chinese subpopulation. Only around 20% of people thought that it was morally unacceptable to use gene editing for embryos to improve their IQ by a small amount. So even higher than in the US. And as I said, there were ethnic differences. So that's not to say that we should allow people to use genetic tests to choose embryos with a higher IQ. We also need some ethical justification for that. But you're starting to see that it's possible to challenge what's often thought to be the mainstream position of opposition to the use of these technologies to promote academic ability. I think this use of gamification and these new platforms, which we will be employing at CBmE, is a very exciting way of accessing huge numbers of people's opinions that can be used to contribute to discussions around policy. And these are just one of the initiatives we're sort of pioneering in advancing the interface between theoretical and empirical bioethics.
Yeah, makes it so good that you're in Singapore, home of Asian values, according to Lee Kuan Yew.
Well, I must confess I'm not an expert in Asian values, but I'm super excited about the progress that I think is on the horizon for Asian values, because I think the old days of Anglo-American dominance of bioethics and ethics is over. And I think they don't exhaust the space of reasonable approaches to ethics. I think there are going to be interesting developments in China, not just technological developments, but developments in different ethical approaches. And I think Singapore is well placed to sort of bridge East and West in this kind of new era of really a different playing field for global bioethics. And likewise human rights. I think human rights has had a lot of traction over the last 50 or so years, but it's by no means the only approach to ethical issues, and indeed it has some significant limitations.
So that leads really beautifully into the reason why we're doing this podcast. We think CBmE is doing some really epic research here. It's really well positioned in the world to lead what I call real-time ethics, ethics in application, practical ethics. And we're really looking forward to being able to translate this research through a podcast so that everyone else can know what we're doing without having to pay to access journals. So thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today.
And dear listeners, we are so excited to share these projects and research in real time. So to get it all started, you can continue to listen to our very next podcast right now.